Welcome to another Climate Tech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. Yossi Quint is founder and CEO of Ark Biotech, a company that's, as he puts it, helping breakthroughs break through. Ark's focus today is on computational bioprocessing in the cultivated meat industry, but their technology looks like it can reach well beyond that. I reached Yossi in Cambridge, as in Harvard, not Cambridge as in Cambridge. Hey, please take 2 seconds to rate this podcast so more people can find it on your platform. Do it now. It would be really appreciated. Thank you so much. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Yossi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You are the founder of Ark Biotech, where one of your catchphrases is that you help breakthroughs break through. And I love that. What does it mean concretely?
There's so much incredible science that's happening in labs all over the world. Like every day, scientists are having breakthroughs, are creating things that can revolutionize and change the world for the better. And yet so little of this science goes from the lab into consumers' hands, directly or indirectly. Unfortunately, most of it starts in the lab and stops in the lab. And one of those reasons is that scaling up, making more of the product and making it cheaper is really hard to do. And specifically, it's really hard to do bioprocess. And so I started Ark to help these companies that have done incredible innovation get from that moment of innovation and some of that incredible work that's done in the lab into the marketplace faster through creating better bioprocess tools.
And your background, I mean, you're a relatively recent grad, class of 2017 from Princeton. When I looked at your academic degree, I mean, this was after I watched some like YouTube stuff with you, read some of your interviews, and I was like, this guy's for sure a scientist himself. But you've got a bachelor's of arts, which I was super surprised to see. And I'm curious, what did you study and how did it lead you to where you are today? And so that's kind of like a leading question, actually, to ask you. What brought you up? I mean, what was the inspiration to build Ark? And then I'm going to ask you some more questions about kind of the product and stuff like that itself.
So when I was in college, I chose to go to Princeton because I really wanted to study math. And Princeton has this eminent math department. But when I got there, I had just taken a gap year and I was in Jerusalem surrounded by religious conflict. And I got really intrigued by the role that religion plays in some of these biggest geopolitical issues or just massive change in the way it impacts people. And so my first semester, I took a religion course and I really loved it. And I ended up studying religion. I also took a lot of other courses like computer science, operations research, and financial engineering. And I was part of Princeton's first ever entrepreneurship minor. And in that entrepreneurship minor, I focused on alternative proteins. And I did my capstone work and a lot of projects related to the alternative protein space, including I wrote a paper where I interviewed Pat Brown, the founder of Impossible Foods. And I actually got my worst grade in all of college on that paper. The professor thought that Impossible Foods was Frankenfood. It would never take off. No consumer would ever want to touch it. Pat actually asked me if I could send him a copy of the paper, and I was so embarrassed by my professor's comments that I never sent it to him.
I'm sure he's read worse.
Yes.
I think he's been a lightning rod for a lot of comments like that.
But I had the opportunity to understand the role that entrepreneurship can play in shaping really important industries. I took a small detour after college that I went to become a quant researcher at a quant hedge fund, where I did modeling and I saw the power of algorithms and data-driven decision-making in enabling and empowering people to not just make a good decision, but to make an optimal decision at incredible speed. And I still had this itch to do something that was more related to alternative proteins, more related to creating positive change in the world. And so went to become a consultant at McKinsey, where I had the opportunity to work with a number of alternative protein companies and had the opportunity to lead a project that was related to biomanufacturing. And during that work, I was really wowed by the incredible science that was being done, by the incredible impact that the startup was having or could have on the world. But when it came to scaling up their process from getting from something that worked really beautifully in the lab to something that could touch consumers and drive global impact, there was this real chasm of bioprocessing. And at least for this company, it was about how do I actually scale up my process in a cost-effective way to a size that was large enough to make a difference. And I was really intrigued by this problem and thought that like, this is the most impactful thing I could possibly do with my life. If I could enable more incredible scientific innovations, whether that's cultivated meat, other more pure play climate tech things, or even medicines that could change people and improve people's lives. If I could enable this technology to get into consumers' hands, that's probably the most impactful thing I could possibly do with my life. And so I quit my job. And as you mentioned, I don't have a scientific background, but I knew I needed to have an incredible scientific co-founder. And so I spent 6 months really searching the world for the right person. I spoke with over 40 different scientific leaders, literally across the world, maybe 5 different continents. And I had the real opportunity to meet Ark's CTO, Zhang Kuang, who is probably one of 20 people in the entire world who has really led an industrial cell culture operation and is also just an Edisonian genius and creative thinker who just every day comes up with brilliant new ideas of how can we actually create bioprocess tools to help these innovations reach the masses.
How do you run a process like that looking for a co-founder? I mean, it's got to be some combination of structure and serendipity. What does it look like?
Yeah, it was a lot of cold outreach messages. I started by going to my network, which is always a good first step. But the role I was looking for was super niche. And yeah, even though I had a good network, I was not finding the quality and relevance that I was looking for. I ended up actually hiring a technical recruiter, paid out of my own pocket. And that person also had no success. And eventually it was just me sending out hundreds of cold emails, LinkedIn messages, going to some conferences. And in the end, it was a cold LinkedIn message that attracted Zhang.
Wow, that's incredible. So that's the serendipity bit there, I guess. Why don't you talk a little bit more about what Ark does? I mean, it's like largely working with modeling for cultivated meat, but why don't you fill us in and also a bit about kind of what the actual products and services that you have?
Yeah. At the core, we're creating computational bioprocess tools to help companies, again, get from whatever scale they are to their desired scale at a better outcome faster. And we do this through 2 product lines. The first one is hardware bioreactors, which are the vessels that cell culture is grown in. And the second one is software to help scientists make better data-driven decisions. On the bioreactor side, we've developed a few really novel technologies, both to change how bioreactors are mixed, to change the control strategy, to change how data is generated and saved. Holistically, our bioreactor systems enable scientists to have more fine-tuned control and be able to grow things that might be more difficult with traditional bioreactors, which are called stir tanks. Stir tanks are like a blender. And if you've ever used a blender, you know that they're really loud and the impeller, the blending mechanism goes really, really fast as you get to bigger speeds, as you need more power into the system to create more mixing. And this is a problem both when you get to really large scale. So if you want to produce a tremendous amount of cultivated meat or some other bio product, but it's also a problem for cell lines that are very shear sensitive. And so some cells, even at small scales, don't like the mechanical shear from the impeller. And so we've created an alternative mixing mechanism that uses gases to create a much more gentle mixing mechanism. And it's also very scalable. And so it preserves the gentleness regardless of scale. So if you have a process that works at 1 liter or 10 liters the size of a water bottle or a keg of beer, it's also going to work at 10,000 liters or 100,000 liters, the size of a small swimming pool or a large swimming pool.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're pretty opinionated about bioreactor design, and I noted that you're not a fan of stirred tanks. And funnily enough, I mean, I've got a story about that as well, because about 12 years ago, I lost a lot of money with a pressure vessel that was using a stirred tank. And I remember thinking, I don't know anything about this stuff from the technological perspective, but I looked at it, I'm like, isn't that propeller too small for the size of that tank? And, hydro or fluid engineers and stuff were looking at me like, what do you know about that? And €1 million later, that was indeed the case. And so the scalability of this, exactly right. I mean, like with a blender, if you imagine that, you can't just multiply a blender by 1,000 and hope that it's going to perform in the same way. So I'm with you that gases are probably a smart way to kind of do that kind of mixing. So that's the kind of physical side of things as well. And let's stick on that for a moment, because there's some interesting things you've said about this as well, that like on the one hand, it's really important to be able, from the industry perspective, to scale up, and that it's not going to work with incremental changes. We need like massive step changes in this industry. And I think the quote that you had was that the biggest bioreactor in the world, which was it from Samsung, if I remember correctly, in South Korea?
Yeah.
Could produce less meat in a year, in cultivated meat, than Tyson Foods, which is one of the major slaughter companies, could produce in a day. So, I mean, that's really interesting from that perspective. But on the flip side, you've also said that units as small as 2,000 liters can lead to profitability. So it's like some of this is mixing the technical and some of it is the kind of market side of things. But I'm curious kind of what you think the dynamics are at play here. You've mentioned before scale automation, robust media supply chain. What are just kind of some of your thoughts on what needs to happen, maybe from a technology perspective, for cultivated meat in particular, because that's a pretty key part of your business to succeed?
Yeah. So cultivated meat, there's not a single solution, or there's no single bullet. For cultivated meat to succeed, or maybe to take a step back, the single biggest barrier today for cultivating meat is not unit economics. It's not taste. It's regulatory approval. And so a lot of incredible technological progress has been made. A lot of incredible supply chain progress has been made. Companies are producing products that taste delicious and that are at a competitive price point in their final form, but are not at market because there's not regulatory approval. And so oftentimes we like to focus on the unit economics or some of the other characteristics and have this debate around scale up, scale out with the right size. And these are the right questions to be asking from the technical team. But as an industry, the issue today is regulatory approval. Assuming regulatory approval is not an issue, or just focusing in on the unit economics or the technical side, if I was running a company's bioprocess, it's really about finding the right solution for the product that you're offering. If you're growing caviar or foie gras, it may be that there's just not, you're only going to be offering into the fanciest restaurants in the world. And so you don't need a tremendous amount of product. And the price point that you are going to sell the product for is much higher. And so in those cases, you could have a bioreactor that's much smaller and still be profitable and produce enough to meet demand. On the other hand, if you're producing a chicken nugget or aiming to be a supplier to McDonald's like Tyson Foods, in that case, you definitely need bioreactors that are hundreds of thousands of liters, and you need an entire farm of those, just because there's so much demand and you're producing a commodity product that needs a commodity price point. To achieve that commodity price point, or to just have the lowest COGS possible, either to maximize profitability or to meet market pricing, then it's really about bringing together the optimal bioprocess and a really robust supply chain with cell lines that can support high densities. And so when we think about cultivating meat's pricing, or at least on the cost side of the equation, as you mentioned, there are really three things. It's the cell line, the media, and the bioprocess, which is the recipe and the thing that the cell is growing. When it comes to the cell line, you're really playing with a few parameters, or there's a few knobs. The first knob is, how does this thing grow? Does it need to grow on something? Isn't it an adherent cell line? Or can it grow in suspension? Is it a single cell suspension, maybe an aggregate cell line? If it is single cell or aggregate, it's often an easier and cheaper process. The second knob is, what media does this cell line need to experience growth and to experience higher growth? Some cell lines just require more media components that are expensive than other cell lines. And so if you're able to develop a cell line that inherently requires cheaper or fewer media inputs, that's another way to save costs. And the third lever is just, how much can this cell grow? At what density does it peak? On the media supply chain, there's a few knobs. One knob is, how can I use the least amount of this ingredient to get the same efficacy? Because it might just be that you're overfeeding the cells. So one is, how do I right feed the cells? Then there's, how can I get a cheaper version of this ingredient, either by sourcing or by finding a one-to-one replacement that does the same thing? Assuming you got the cell line and media right, then it's, what is the recipe to feed the cell lines, to control the temperature, control the agitation rate, the power that the cells experience, the oxygenation, all the things that people need, in the right format, in the right vessel, get optimal performance. And that's where we come in. And our software helps optimize that bioprocess, and our hardware helps support peak performance.
Let's get into the software side of things a little bit more as well. So, I mean, AI is powering lots of things right now, but I've seen it firsthand, how it's specifically with cell lines and how it's done the work that, could take years and years much faster. So these kinds of things where it's like a huge data set, lots of combinations, lots of computational power required, but a pretty kind of rote process, right? We're not asking it to mimic Shakespeare or something like that. So, what are you doing on the software side? Are you building your own kind of large language model for this, or how is that working?
So our software offering, which we call our bioprocess Copilot, is a high fidelity virtual bioreactor. And so we're aiming to move much of the experimentation that's being done today in the lab or in factories onto the cloud, which enables people to run experiments instead of in days or weeks, in seconds. And instead of having to wait and be constrained by the equipment you have or the people you have, you can run 1,000 experiments all before you would have even set up your first experiment in the lab. And so it's radically faster, radically expands the operating space, and enables scientists to run 1,000x or 10,000x number of experiments at a fraction of the cost. You mentioned AI, and we certainly are very much exploring the latest in AI to bring in the best feature set. But one of the challenges of bioprocess is that it's really small data, and the data quality is usually really, really poor. And so, while AI has been used really effectively on the cell line side or even on the media side, it has not been used effectively on the bioprocess side, just given the limitations in data. And so the approach that we use primarily is called mechanistic modeling. And that's about figuring out the set of physics, chemistry, biology equations that represent what's happening in the physical world. And through writing the code for what's going on physically in a virtual environment, we're able to mimic the process in a really high fidelity way.
There are a couple of comments that you've made. Also, one in January at Tufts University at the Cellular Ag Innovation Day. Cultivated is a lot further ahead than people think, which I'd love to hear. That's 7 months ago, so that's light years in this industry. And, I would be interested, just as a kind of a theoretical exercise, as someone, most of the time when I talk to people who are in cultivated meat, they're representing one specific approach and one specific product. And of course, therefore, they're championing that one. But as someone who's kind of sitting above it all and kind of looking at this and kind of running the different scenarios, and I ask this totally selfishly because for listeners of the podcast, they'll know that my whole goal for being involved as an investor in alternative proteins is that one day I want to eat a chicken wing again, like a real chicken wing with really spicy sauce on it, and I'm going to take a week off and just get sweatpants 2 sizes too big, turn my phone off, and that's going to be my best vacation ever, eating a chicken wing for the first time in 18, it would be 18 years if it was today. But if you were to like centrally plan the whole cultivated meat industry, how would you roll it out? You mentioned caviar, foie gras, kind of these like lower volume, higher price things. Would you start there? Would you, and this is just you as an entrepreneur, if you were to choose, would you start there, or would you be making those nuggets like Tyson?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of different routes and that are all really high impact. Certainly from a unit economics perspective, it's easy to be profitable with something that is high end, either that is the same thing cellularly as some of these high end goods, just produced in a more humane environmental fashion, or even a new food category. Like there's a company, Biofoods in Australia, that are producing a product that they also talk about being akin to Cheerios. It's just a new thing. It is animal cells, but it is not something that we could bucket into a category. And those are all great approaches because those could be helpful from consumer acceptance perspective. That could be helpful from a price point perspective. And then the other part of me says, if you're going to do it, you got to go big and go after the absolutely biggest buckets today. And that's chicken from a animal perspective, or fish from an animal perspective, or beef from an environmental perspective. And so there's not a single approach that to me is the obvious one. They're all highly valuable. And within each of them, there's so much that we're learning as we go, and also so many shared problems. Like, well, the cell line is different, and that has some important key differentiators. When we work with so many of these companies, what we find is that they share a lot more than that differentiates them.
I like the approach in pet food. So my good friend Shannon Faulkner is the founder and CEO of BioCraft Pet Nutrition. Their approach is that both from a cost effectiveness, so the ideal form for providing a pet food ingredient is as a slurry, which is pretty easy to make from, because you're building up rather than tearing down like with slaughter. So you're building up and then you don't have to go all the way up. And it's really once you start trying to get this kind of scaffolding and steaks and these like fibrous things, that's when it gets really expensive and these continuous processes break down. So on one hand, and on the other hand, her view is, look, this is the consumer acceptance, of cultivated through pet food might be so much higher as a place to start than going after, we've seen this before with plant-based, where it's like, maybe don't go for people's like T-bone steaks right from the beginning, or these like culturally significant things like sausages or hot dogs or something like that, and start with some other things, get some reps in on this and then go for the foods that are like, that they grew up with and have these kind of very sentimental attachments to.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And another benefit of that approach is that there are fewer regulatory hurdles in pet food. And so definitely a lot to benefit there. When I think about the cultural barriers, that doesn't worry me as much. That worries me from a regulatory perspective of culture wars and regulators making decisions coming from a place of constituencies that are adverse to this. But when it comes to just consumer sales, the world is so large and there's so many niches. And so whether that's in Europe, like the 10 to 15% of people who identify as flexitarian, and the 6 to 8% of people who identify as vegetarian, then the low single digit people that identify as vegan, and then the people who are environmentally forward or have some allergy. And so there's so many small groups that get initial market traction. To me, isn't the challenge, and we haven't seen it be the challenge in the cultivated space. It's really, can I get my product approved, and then can I produce enough of it to meet consumer appetite?
Yeah, interesting. I live in Austria, which is kind of on the fence right now, and there are bills here in Parliament at the moment talking about banning cultivated meat the way Italy did, not too long ago. And as we know, if you're in the industry, you know that it's coming from lobbyists, it's coming from kind of populist points of view. There's no real there's no real scientific reason to do it. But we're seeing it in Europe really play out. I mean, in the US, you're seeing it state by state. Here, we're seeing it country by country, where countries like Denmark, Netherlands, UK and Germany are putting tons of money into funding this and being like, hey, this is like an exciting industry that we should be supporting. And you have other countries being like, let's ban it. And it's going to be really interesting to see where the chips land. I mean, speaking of kind of the geographical element as well, I think we saw this largely with COVID and kind of supply chain disruptions for things like meat. But I think, with the world as it is now and kind of as we move away probably from the peak of globalization that we've seen before, food security and being able to produce within domestically within each country's borders is probably becoming more important, even if it's not, front page news at the moment. You said before that the forthcoming chip war will be in biology. And from a US perspective, it's imperative that the US government ensures that these pioneering breakthroughs occur within our borders, securing our national security, bolstering our economy, and safeguarding our planet. What is your sense from a US perspective about how front of mind that message is?
First of all, there's just we're at this pivotal moment in history where what our generation decides can forever impact where bioproduced goods are. And there's these generational moments or inflection points when different goods impact the world. And so when it comes to the chips, see the where all the chips are produced today, and we see the impact that has on national security. When you look at food, when you look at meat, historically meat was produced where there were large grassy plains and temperate climates. And so if you had the right geography, you had a monopoly. So the US produced a lot of meat, parts of South America produced a lot of meat, parts of Europe produced a lot of meat. And while that still exists today to a large degree, or the same way to a large degree, we are now seeing countries like in the Middle East that are producing indoor air-conditioned farms to grow chickens, or China that's producing multi-story buildings for pig farming. And so today still, when it comes to beef is still very much tied to climate and to geography. But when it comes to other things like aquaculture, like fish can now be grown almost anywhere. And we're starting to see a decentralization of fish production. And with this is a lot of dollars and national security. Access to food and access to supply chains is critical. And COVID was a daily reminder for most of us of going to supermarkets, not being able to access things. But this access to goods plays out across all levels, from food to chips to medicine. And sometimes it has the opportunity to impact hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs and security. And so what the bioeconomy, and cultivated meat being a key part of this bioeconomy, offers is a new chapter of decentralization, where the focus areas or the epicenter of production will not be because of geography or because of some historical precedent, but will be where people are willing to invest money in putting steel in the ground and building up Industry 4.0 manufacturing around it, while ensuring a regulatory environment that is friendly. And countries like the US or countries within the European Union have a decision to make. Do I want the future jobs, the future of national security to be on my borders, within my borders? Do I want my economy to be boosted by this bioeconomy? Or am I going to be fearful of something or be beholden to a small, loud faction of people who are going to have these jobs be shipped overseas, forcing us to be net importers at best, or at worst in a position where some of the most important goods produced in the entire world are not accessible to us?
Yeah, I think that's very well put. For those of us who don't live in the US and don't totally understand the federalist system, there. What does it mean, practically speaking, when Florida says we're banning cultivated meat? Does that have real legs? Can that happen state by state? And is this going to be just a patchwork of, across the US that you're going to be able to buy cultivated burger in this town and you cross the state line and you're in handcuffs if you're eating it in the car on the way over? What does this look like in practical terms, or does anyone know?
Yeah, the jury is still out, both figuratively and literally. These are questions that are being adjudicated across the country. Yeah, so to be seen what this means, but at a minimum, it means that there are states where it's a really adverse environment for R&D, where companies are choosing not to locate, where government bodies are not giving grants, where universities are not doing research, and where new industries are being put on hold. And so while it is certainly disappointing for us that are in this space work, doing avant-garde work, it's also a real loss for these states who are losing jobs to places that are more welcoming and more innovation focused.
Looking at your background and at some of the team, it feels like there's a thread also, beyond the entrepreneurship side, but also kind of maybe on the activist side or like an animal rights side of things. Did you ever consider becoming an activist?
When I was younger, I really I was always very focused on doing the thing that would be most impactful with my life. I truly believe you only live once, and that we each have only a few shots at really creating a world that we're proud of and leaving the world a better place than we found it. And so for me, activism was certainly on the table. And one of the things that changed my vantage point was a social entrepreneurship class that I took in college with the professor, John Danner. And the course is called Social Entrepreneurship. And every class, the professor highlighted a company that was creating tremendous positive impact through entrepreneurship, through bringing new products to market. And when I think about the skill sets that I have and the opportunities that I have, at least for me, I truly believe that helping more companies get their innovations to market has the opportunity to create much larger change than anything else that I could do.
Okay, so it was really an efficiency kind of consideration. I mean, that's maybe not surprising.
That's an efficient way to put it, yes.
Yeah. You ran it through the old noggin, and that's what came out in terms of impact. For listeners who would like to somehow help out with ARK's mission, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you, and what could they do?
So definitely feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn. You could email me or send a message through our website, ark-biotech.com. We are always on the lookout for incredible talent. Right now, we're hiring a quantitative software engineer, a modeler. We're continuously hiring other types of scientists, mechanical engineers, automation engineers, commercial leaders. And so that's one way. Another way is if you're a company in the climate space that has a process that has cells or microbes and is looking to scale that up or to optimize that process, would be happy to share more about the hardware and the software that we're building and how it can empower leading companies to get to market faster and improve their cost position.
Brilliant. And as always, those links will be in the show notes. Yossi, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure talking to you today.
Thanks for listening to another Climate Tech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now.